to again thank Catherine, Kirsten and Oscar for organising such a wonderful seminar today. Yes, I'm feeling rather intimidated following Simon's excellent paper. And if you do switch off, I can completely understand, particularly as I'm kind of here under false pretenses because there's not a great deal about ubiquitous music in my paper. It's the beginnings of the project, which I'm hoping will develop into something which is thinking about the ways in which the shift from geocentric ideas about the world in relation to the universe changed to heliocentrism, feeds into literary production in the 17th century, but also the ways in which music also forms part of these discussions. So it's a very sketchy paper, and I apologise in advance. In 1638, a picaresque novel, a tale, I shouldn't really call it a novel, I think, entitled The Man in the Moon, was published posthumously and pseudonymously. The real author was Francis Godwin, Bishop of Hereford. And that's another thing, actually. It's really weird how many vicars get really interested in the moon at this time and write strange stories about it. But it's presented to read in public as the first part of a memoir by a Spaniard called Domingo Gonzalez. Gonzalez is a merchant traveller and an empiricist who, harnessed to a flock of flying birds, journeys to the moon. Here he encounters a perfect lunar society where, despite language barriers and the celestial beings instinctively bow when he mentions the name of Jesus. And in the text, he looks at them and says, "Oh, Jesus!" And they hear Jesus and then think that he's saying something godly instead. And so there's a kind of sense of miscommunication in terms of language, but also a sense of affinity through language. And Jesus is the one word that they both remember, that they both recognise. So echoing utopian fictions such as Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, Christianity connects strangers, harmoniously uniting traveller and settler within God's creation. The lunar dwellers thus welcome Gonzalez, offer him support, home, and help him to learn their language. Despite the hospitality and the better living conditions he encounters on the moon, Gonzalez then decides to travel back to Earth because he misses his wife and children. When he returns, Gonzalez is still far from home, and he lands in China, and the narrative ends with him living amongst Jesuit missionaries who persuade him to write an account of his travels and travails. The text is often considered as the first piece of science fiction written in the English language, but I think this anxiety of trying to place it within the genre of the science fiction kind of presents some challenges. And a more productive way of understanding the text might be through its indebtedness to utopian fiction and to travel writing. In writing about travel, irony sits at the threshold of the author's imagination in relaying a tale and the reader's credulity in accepting or rejecting the veracity of the narrative. Pressure is placed on knowledge and understanding of the real, the unreal, and the unknown. Conversely, utopian writing's irony is embedded in how it functions as a form of fictional writing that encourages reflections on the early modern state. Godwin's text playfully maps these patterns of irony onto the cosmic. The narrative plots of vast terrain through its references to spaces as far afield as the Americas, China, and the moon. Whether terrestrial or extraterrestrial, all these spaces are real, though how those spaces are inhabited and occupied isn't. There's a tension between the narrative's presentation of an authentic account of a journey and the fabricated travel of its protagonist. Due to these affinities of utopian writing and tales of travel, The Man in the Moon thus sits uneasily as the origin myth of the first English science fiction, despite its sustained popularity in the 17th century. And it actually has a massive influence on later writers, particularly texts such as Gulliver's Travels. And so even though it's perhaps not particularly well known to us today, it has a kind of long history in terms of the kinds of writings that come after it. So instead, this text marries Copernican theory and developments in how the universe is understood with utopian fiction, the apparatus of travel writing, politics, and religion. Godwin draws from these various literary conventions and epistemologies to prevent a narrative that makes claims to known truths about the wider cosmos, terrestrial and extraterrestrial beings, and the relationship between God and his creation. For all its fabrications, this fantastical story is presented as an authentic travelogue, which casts doubt on the narrator's truthfulness and the reliability of Gonzalez as a narrator. This paper, you finally will read it. We need to know that this is the point where you will find out what I'm talking about. But this paper will address how Godwin uses knowledge of the cosmos, observation, and natural philosophy to present the fictional lunar civilization. I will suggest that terrestrial space, textual space, and sound destabilize the harmonious state of being that Godwin establishes on the moon. The generic conventions and paratextual operators employed undermine the narrative, casting doubts on cosmic knowledge, and instead assert bodily and embodied experience as the key to gaining knowledge of the cosmos. Sound and the representation of speech as song is crucial to these ways of knowing the ambiguity between the sound of extraterrestrial speech and song places pressure on this textual representation. So the kind of very brief summary of Copernican theory is that in 1609, Galileo provides empirical evidence that there is more than one fixed point in the universe and that orbs wandered around orbs. And these findings, along with those of other astronomers, revolutionized ways of knowing the wider world, the cosmos, and humanity's status in creation, leading to renewed fascination in the relationship between humanity and the heaven. If any historians of science are here, please don't take me for just, summarising it so briefly like that. But I think that despite this, and it is very clear that kind of 639 is a turning point, and people who previously admired Copernicus' mathematics but thought that his idea that the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe was a bit weird. There are still people who do not recognise or are unwilling to accept that and embrace the heliocentric universe. And this can be seen in a letter that Edward Conway wrote to his daughter-in-law Anne in 1651. And I won't, for reasons of time, I won't read these out, but they're here to distract you from the nonsense that I'm saying. But you can see particular words of the idea of the world Earth as a heavy, dull, gross body. And he thinks of this as so absurd. It's like princes dancing with the old women rather than young women. So yeah, a bit of a patch of misogyny there as well. But in the geocentric universe, base mutable matter and death made up the gross body that was a sublunary sphere. In The Man in the Moon, the bulky coarseness of the Earth is reaffirmed in the lunar dweller's perception of the misery of that place. And the Earth for the moon dwellers serves as a sort of preemptive penal colony. In the on the PowerPoint, so you can see that the Earth is presented as a site of punishment for lunar dwellers who are dropped onto a high mountain in America. This exile is presented as a preventative measure. So they basically kind of identify who are likely to commit crimes. And instead of having a prison to put them in as a punishment after they committed the crime, they just kind of exile them from the Earth. I'd like to focus on where it says changing for other children. So changing for other children implies that Earthlings may be elevated to the moon through grace. This is in contrast to the medieval myth where exile to the moon is figured as a punishment for Sabbath breaking and serves as a warning to others. In these early configurations, the moon is a liminal space between the celestial and the mutable. The exiled Sabbath breaker is placed beyond the realm of death and forced to spend eternity in solitary confinement, or become kind of a feature in that creepy John Lewis advert from a few years ago at Christmas time. Godwin reverses the trope of the man in the moon to present the moon as a space of enlightenment, but in so doing exposes tensions between different ways in which the moon was understood, as both the threshold to perfection and a space where outcasts reside. This presentation of the relationship between the moon and the Americas shares similar paradoxes with discovery narratives that seek to present the New World as one, virgin territory that is rightfully taken by European settlers, two, an Edenic space that spews forth an abundance of valuable raw materials, or a land and climate are perfectly tempered for the production of food, three, where Native Americans resemble pre-lapsarian humanity. Yet some accounts of the Americas also drew attention to the harsh realities of colonialism and interactions within colonized spaces. When Columbus set sail in 1492, his intention was not to discover the Americas, but instead his long study of medieval sources led him to set sail for the Far East and the Garden of Eden. Based on the assumption that those who lived closest to the Garden of Eden would speak Hebrew or a variant of it, Columbus took with him readers who knew Hebrew, Chaldean, and some Arabic. These linguistic assumptions proved spectacularly wrong, but might offer some clues as to why the Americas were configured as a new world and an Edenic space to readers of travel writing. It represents an anxiety to make sense of the world through marrying long-established understandings of terrestrial space and mapping with new forms of knowledge. Similar anxiety shaped the narrative of the Man in the Moon. In their exchange of native lunar dwellers for Native Americans, the Americas become repackaged as a contact zone between the terrestrial and celestial. The Moon children are held on the peak of the highest mountain, the Americas, until the Earth's atmosphere changes their theme tone. So again, in that sort of ambiguous, not quite explaining way that utopian fiction employs, the moon dwellers are described as having a sort of blue skin, but a skin that we can't really understand as humans because it's unlike any tone that we're used to. And something that I need to think about more is how this might potentially connect to the kind of images of tattoos on Native American bodies, which are circulated in Europe. But Godwin draws from utopian imposition to avoid offering a counter relationship between the naughty changeling moon children and the kidnapped Native Americans. The points of connection between the moon and the earth present the moon and its inhabitants as being closer to God in a Christian ordered universe. Older epistemologies that place the moon as a threshold of the celestial sphere where perfection resides collapse into empirical truths as Godwin attempts to reconcile two apparently opposing forms of knowledge. Optics and observation are central to Godwin's narrative and to what Aisha Ramachandran has termed world-making, the gradual process whereby early modern Europe moves away from considering the cosmos through the lens of God's ordered creation and the interconnectedness of all things, to understanding it as a decentered space. This raises questions about where humanity sits in the universe in relation to other beings. In The Man in the Moon, Gonzalez's cosmic affinity with the lunar dwellers means he is accepted with some qualifications into their society, and his dexterity at language learning allows him to traverse different potentially hostile territories. Janey's face, The Man in the Moon, makes its worlds by reconciling a decentered heliocentric universe with an interconnected geocentric cosmos that has been created according to God's divine word. Godwin thus engages with the turn to heliocentrism to present an image of order and harmony in the cosmos. In his text, Gonzalez scoffed at philosophers and mathematicians who lean blind to what is made evident through observation. But later in the narrative, the myths and fables of the moon are commented upon. So I'll hold that up for a little bit longer before moving on to the next vote. So we've got here a kind of origin myth for the moon itself, and that origin myth revolves around the idea that an earthling journeyed to the moon at some point and settled on the moon, and the resultant acculturation processes that take place all kind of happen as a consequence of this first moon landing and lunar voyage. Through marriage, the previous earthling thus established a dynasty before they too returned to the earth. Gonzalez can only dismiss this as a founding myth, as no evidence remains in terrestrial chronicles of anyone before him journeying into the moon. But Gonzalez's observation regarding the integrity of the lunar society leads him to pause in his doubt. Truth drawn from an eyewitness account contradicts truth drawn from received wisdom, calling to question the nature of belief and disbelief and what knowledge acquisition is valued. This is compounded by the reliability of Gonzalez as a narrator. The narrator consistently notes that Gonzalez was an eyewitness to events, documented, privileging sight over other sensory experience. Such appeals to eyewitnesses are common in travel writing, asking the reader to trust what the traveller saw. But, and this is the point where finally it gets on to Sound of Music, recently Emily Murphy has drawn attention to the role of ear witnessing in travel writing. Sound, as Jennifer Linhard Wood notes, is a prominent feature of cross-cultural contact in both early modern drama and travel literature. In the narratives of sound, sounds of other cultures variously frighten, disorient, and delight English and European visitors, even as the sounds of otherness are sometimes ethnographically inscribed, and writers' bodies are overtaken and calibrated with foreign sounds. For words, vibrating sound has a transformative effect that is connected to becoming, belonging, and othering. Sound waves pass through the body of the hearer, disrupting divides between what is familiar and what is alien. In the context of contact zones, hearing can be an uncanny experience, meaning that otherness reverberates around the body of the listener, enabling an attempt to interpret, explain, and encode what is other. Sound waves cut across sensory experience, blurring the distinctions of what is heard, felt, and seen. Murphy suggests travel writers activated ears to reassure their readers, and that's a quote that I jotted down from the paper that somebody gave last year. And I wish I was better at remembering the context of it, but travel writers activated ears to reassure their readers, and Murphy also homes in on texts such as the Hugo traveller Jean Deliri's history, published in 1578, and detailing his experiences as a missionary in Brazil 20 years previously. And this text was translated into English and included in Purpose of Pilgrims. In discussing the sounds of the number, Leary resorts to phonetic spelling and also to musical notation to articulate diction and tone, and forcing Native American speech, song, and dance into European context. The focus is on conveying textually the reality of what is being heard. Cultural difference is articulated through sound being inscribed through Western notation and the Latin alphabet, asking the reader to put faith in the trustworthiness of the traveller's ear witnessing, and creating a cultural dissonance between the visual representation of sound and its verbal utterances. Similarly, Godwin uses musical notation to illustrate the language of the lunar dweller. So again, we get that here we have the sense of the language not being able to be articulated in any way. And those of you familiar with Thomas More's Utopias might recall the alphabet that he uses at the beginning of that to kind of present utopian languages different or other to European languages. And we have a similar thing going on with the use of notation here. But I'm sure that everyone who reads music in the room can see that it's kind of gobbledygook. It's difficult to really turn that beyond the kind of basic picture. It's difficult to really transcribe that into something which you can then make sense of. So Godwin writes, the difficulty of that language is not to be conceived, and the reasons thereof are especially two. First, because it hath no affinity with any others that ever I heard. Secondly, because it consists of not so much of words and letters as of tunes and uncouth sounds that no letters can express. For you have few words, but they signify diverse several things, and they are distinguished only by their tunes that are, as it were, sung in the utterance of them. Yea, many words there are consisting of tunes only, as if they list, they will utter their minds in tunes without words. And I'm not sure if this is so much representative of ubiquitous music, so much as with the ubiquity of music. It's a kind of shorthand for the reader to engage with the kind of alienness of this language through something which feels familiar. So there's a kind of uncanny experience in Linhart Woods, in Jonathan Linhart's Woods, in terms of the presentation of the I guess the functionality of music within this. But I think as well, the focus on uncouth sounds mirrors Leary's description of the trembling voices and savage howls of the utterances of the tooth number. But what particularly interests me here is how the sounds are understood. The reputation of lunar speech insists on the language's knowability, thanks to how it blurs the distinction between speech and song. In focusing on tunes, Godwin is alluding to the rhetorical function of the voice, the way we regulate our breath, modulate our tone, and control our intonation. And diction are all parts of how language and language communication functions and affects how the listener receives our words, regardless of whether those words are spoken or sung. Tunes without words implies that sounds could be divorced from language, but uncouth sounds that no letters can express tells a different story. We're presented with the limits of human knowledge and understanding, and the suggestion that recognition of tonal patterns is culturally contingent. The sounds cannot be organized phonetically in the Latin alphabet, and thus they are dismissed as wordless. But this is a trope in keeping with the way utopian narratives seem to reveal knowledge of an unknown culture while obfuscating it. It also asks us to consider the tunefulness of words. Rather than being tunes without words, the lunar dwellers convey meaning through a very tonal register, a register that has been identified by some critics as being derived from how Chinese was understood in early modern Europe. I think that's an argument which might need to be taken with caution, because Ben Campbell has made some suggestions that it might be an erroneous connection to make as a consequence of Gonzalez ending up in China at the end of the narrative. So thus the lunar dwellers might be connected to different points of the earth through mobility, through the dumping of their naughty offspring on the Americas, and through sound-like qualities and linguistic patterns that might bear some semblance to sounds in China. So at the end of the narrative, Gonzalez lands in China, where he relays his adventures to the Pitoja, a real Jesuit missionary who wrote an account of China that was published in Purkis's Pilgrims. And sorry, I've accidentally lost my place. It was published in Purkis's Pilgrims. These intertextual resonances illustrate how Godwin understood and appropriated tropes common to travel writing, and combined eye and ear witness accounts playfully and implores the reader to believe the narrative. But this assertion of truth made through adopting travel writing tropes is compounded by the difficulty that lies at the heart of all travel writing, and that is the reliability of the narrator. Travelogues, as Hannah Holmberg reminds us, showed the traveller's resourcefulness in negotiating hostile territory and at times how the traveller needed to dissimulate. Gonzalez's eyewitness and ear witness accounts rely upon the reader's credulity in accepting the truth of the tale that is related and buying into his resourcefulness to overcome hardships, conflicts, and diplomatically ingratiate himself with potentially hostile communities. So again, this kind of tunes about words kind of reminds me a bit of the clangers, so it's difficult to kind of see them as hostile clangers. But the narrative is set in the twilight years of Elizabeth I's reign, a time of tensions between Spain and England, and when being a Jesuit priest in England was punishable by death. By ending the narrative with Jesuit priests encouraging Gonzalez to commit his story to paper, Godwin confronts his readers with how much they ought to trust Gonzalez's assertion of truth, especially with regards to matters of faith. These tensions mean that Gonzalez is ultimately presented as an untrustworthy narrator. For some 17th century natural philosophers, ways of knowing and understanding the material world could be understood through what Ramachandran has identified as engaging the speculative power of intellect by exploiting the blurry boundaries between the hypothetical and the real. The epistemic power of fictional writing can reveal philosophical truths. In being constructed as an ear and eyewitness account, The Man in the Moon collapses these blurry boundaries, leading an ontological collision of the hypothetical and the real. And this is the concluding paragraph. So the imprecision in representing language through conflating speech with song and appearing to present lunar language through incomplete musical notation further emphasizes the general imprecision of the story. Sitting at the threshold of fact and fiction, The Man in the Moon has an uneasy relationship with the narrative strategies it employs as it seeks to reconfigure the space and sounds of the moon in light of Copernicus and Galileo. The Man in the Moon may be constructed as a first-hand account of the experience of travel, but it suffers the same fate as travelogue. It begs readers to suspend their skepticism, imagine the tale to be true instead of knowing the tale to be true. Thank you.